Okay, so David, thank you very much for speaking to me and to the students and others at the University of Waterloo. I'm very interested in what you're going to have to say today about manufacturing and its importance. You're a technology leader in the manufacturing sector today. Your role as Chief Strategy Officer at NGEN is going to have a significant impact, I think, on the manufacturing sector here. How did your career lead you to this point?
Well, first I have to take umbrage at the notion that I'm a technology leader, right? But you're right, as Chief Strategy Officer at NGEN, which stands for Next Generation Manufacturing Canada, I certainly have a role to play in the relationship between technology and manufacturing. I came to this via a rather circuitous route, I would think. I spent most of my career in Ottawa as a public servant, and in that part of my career I spent a lot of time at Industry Canada, where I was Assistant Deputy Minister of Policy, which meant I was responsible for microeconomic policy of the Government of Canada, and then prior to that I was Assistant Deputy Minister of the Industry Sector, where I was responsible for various sectors like aerospace, auto, steel, etc. So there was an exposure to kind of the economy in a way that was very intense at the microeconomic level. I went from there to, I came to Waterloo, to the University of Waterloo, where I was the Executive Director of the Institute for Quantum Computing. From there I went to Los Angeles as Canada's Consul General, so I was a diplomat for 6 years. When that term ended, I retired from the Government of Canada. We returned to Waterloo, and I became the chair of the Waterloo Innovation Summit, which was a University of Waterloo initiative. I did that for a few years. Then I went to the National Research Council as a special advisor for the president of the NRC, and that then kind of transmogrified into this role with the Advanced Manufacturing Supercluster.
Fascinating background, and makes you, I think, well qualified to talk about manufacturing in
There's
Canada.
been a lot of exposure to different aspects of technology and manufacturing, yes.
So with that in mind, why is manufacturing so important to Canada today? A lot of people might think that we're now moving into a high-tech future where, manufacturing won't be quite so important. Why do you think it is important today?
Historically, I mean, let's start back. I'm actually an historian by training. Historically, manufacturing has been very, very important. And when you look at the contribution that manufacturing in general has made to the Canadian GDP, it's been very significant. So GDP, jobs, communities across the country, manufacturing has been very, very important. That part of the economy, that share of GDP has been declining over the last decades. And the result of that has been, we've seen that in remote communities, rural communities, and in cities across the country. The decline of manufacturing has had a serious impact. So it's something that we need to pay attention to. It's a job creator, it can be. So it's important from that perspective. It's important for what it means for the communities in which it happens. That's why we pay attention. If it weren't important in those senses, the government as a whole wouldn't pay that much attention to it, but it is. And we see its impact most graphically when companies shut down plants. The GM decision to close Oshawa has an immediate, tangible, very kind of visceral impact on the people who live in Oshawa. And not just the people who work for those plants, but the people who depend on the income of those people buying things. So the impact of manufacturing is, it permeates the economy, it permeates society.
Okay, and that would explain why you're now working for NGEN. Can you tell me about what NGEN is and what they do and
Sure.
what they're hoping to achieve?
What they're hoping to do mostly. So NGEN is the Advanced Manufacturing Supercluster. the federal government back 2 years ago launched a competition for the creation of up to 5 superclusters. It identified several different thematic areas where they were looking for bids, and I participated in the working group working up the application for the Advanced Manufacturing Supercluster here in Southern Ontario. What do we hope to do? I talked about the decline of manufacturing in relative terms, and a large part of that decline comes as a result of the slowness or lagging of Canadian manufacturers in adopting technologies. And so what we're looking to do is to kind of arrest that decline, and by making manufacturers, people in the business, aware of what are the technologies that are out there, and getting them to the point where they're comfortable with them, where they understand kind of what the opportunities might be, and then it's how do you apply it, how do you integrate it into your business. And it's kind of that entire continuum of awareness through to integration. And I think what we find with Canadian manufacturers is they're generally a conservative lot. And for good reason. That's not necessarily a criticism, but it's easily explicable why they are conservative and cautious. But I think the reality is that they need to be seized with the urgency of making some of these changes. And so when we talk about advanced manufacturing, what we're talking about is really the integration of various types of technologies into manufacturing processes and products. And 2 examples that I like to use. So there's old style manufacturing, the making of cars. And as we all know, that world of auto manufacturing is being transformed. And so that kind of manufacturing, by definition, understands the importance of integrating new technologies. And we see that in every model year that comes out. Every manufacturer is coming out with models that integrate new technologies in new ways. So that's kind of the conventional manufacturing world and how it's already an example of advanced manufacturing. And then you've got totally new products, drones, robots, they didn't exist 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So these are both examples of advanced technologies, new technologies that lead to new types of manufacturing. And so, we're looking at not just, how do we support the growth of robotics companies, and let's forget about old style manufacturing. The making of cars and planes and steel products, etc., continues to be very important. Those continue to be important employers. So what are the things that we need to do to support them becoming more competitive? And for those companies that are kind of Canadian-based, large multinationals that have penetration of foreign markets, how do we get our suppliers, the smaller Canadian companies, integrated into those supply chains? And that's something that's really important to us too, and trying to figure out, okay, so what are the issues in that integration into supply chain that need to be addressed that aren't being addressed?
A wide range in area and a lot of changes for these relatively conservative organizations. As you say, not necessarily a bad thing. Being conservative in running a manufacturing plant is probably a good thing in achieving the reliability that and other things that needs to be achieved. But what you're talking about, I guess, is digital transformation inside the manufacturing sector, quite a large change. And you talked a little bit about the technologies that might feature inside that. Did you want to talk perhaps a little more about what those technologies are that organizations are now have available to them, I guess?
Well, digital twinning would be an example of how companies can take a new approach to understanding the work that they're doing, the workplace organization, as they think about transforming the workplace. It's now possible to come in, create a digital image, and actually plan out a new way of structuring your workplace and your work processes. So the digitization of this has created the possibility for a whole new way of imagining change and bringing effect to change.
Fascinating. And how does Canada compare? Because presumably a lot of our manufacturing is exported. We're competing against manufacturers in other countries. How are we doing in comparison to them in these areas?
In general terms, we're not doing as well as we should be doing. I mean, we have some real champions, and in the auto sector, we have some tier one suppliers, companies like Linamar and Magna and Woodbridge. These are excellent companies that compete easily, and very effectively abroad, and indeed have a footprint that is really, really impressive. But in general, Canadian manufacturers lag behind their US and European counterparts, and it's a function of this conservatism. They tend not to invest in the technologies required. They tend not to invest in machinery and equipment. And that part is true, and then you start, well, what does that mean? Like, why? Why is that happening? Why are they not doing that? And that's kind of goes back to my earlier comment about their conservatism. You kind of understand why. You would think that this might mean they're not profitable. They may not be competitive globally, but they're profitable. And so for many small manufacturers, the incentive to grow isn't as strong. And so they're kind of stuck in this rather comfortable niche. The risk, of course, is that the world is changing, and the world's changing very quickly, and eventually their local markets are going to be overtaken by others who have been less conservative and less cautious. But and so the challenge for us is encouraging those who are willing to take bigger risks and willing to look at how do we grow and how do we look beyond our comfortable local market to something that requires us to be exporting more. And we know, and you alluded to it, we are an export-driven economy, but most of our companies don't export. And so, how do we get more and more companies to do that is the question. At NGEN, we're looking within the advanced manufacturing sector. That's part of our challenge is how do we create the incentives, and what are the incentive structures we can put in place to kind of draw those companies that are slow to adopt technologies out of that resistance.
And the importance of that is presumably that technology now enables a bigger gap in terms of performance to develop. Those who do adopt it successfully are going to be having lower prices, higher quality than those that don't, in a significant way that eventually, that sooner sometimes than later,
right,
that's going to impact Canadian companies that aren't fast enough.
Yeah, but yes, you're right. But I go back to the smallness of our economy and the smallness of the firm. We are a country of small companies. Just one indicator of that. The United States, we're very comfortable with the notion that it's 10 times larger, so magnify everything by 10 and you kind of get the sense of kind of the difference between Canada and the US. When it comes to large firms, the United States has 112 times more large firms than we do. And by large firms, I mean firms over 500. Mm-hmm. So, SMEs, we count that as 500 and less. So, it's the large firms that have that very significant impact on kind of a local community and that I was talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. We have fewer of those. We have more, the preponderance of our firms are small. So what does that mean when it comes to kind of the things you were just talking about, making those decisions to invest? Small companies usually are just struggling to kind of make do with what they have. And, talent, the availability of talent to kind of understand the technology. Do small companies have CTOs? So, a lot of them don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do they have the kind of business expertise to understand the implications of new technology and to integrate it into into their process? Again, for many companies, that's a decision to spend extra time. There's an opportunity cost that goes with, okay, so I'm going to go out and learn all that, and what's it going to do for running my business? So, you know, from a business management perspective, when you're in a small business, it's difficult to, a lot of people see that as difficult to spend the time and investment in their human capital going and doing that. And that's one of the reasons for the conservatism.
Yeah, this is a very interesting area, I think, because potentially with smaller businesses, in some ways, you know, if assistance or advice isn't provided there, if they don't change what they're doing, they're at more of a disadvantage perhaps by the introduction of technology in manufacturing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an area for concern. Another area where I'm keen to understand the impact is employees in manufacturing companies. We've heard a lot about automation, some predictions of jobs being lost, other predictions of there being a lot more jobs. There's a range of opinion on this area. What do you think will happen with employees in manufacturing companies that are adopting new technologies?
The disruption is there. We see the disruption, and you know, the process that we're talking about, the integration of technologies into companies, into manufacturing, is inherently disruptive. In many of the cases where this is happening, it is possible for retraining to take place, and so, you know, from a CEO's perspective, you can look at this and say, like, I can adopt or adapt this technology, and I've got the skill set here, or I need to retrain a little bit, but I can do that. So there's that aspect to it. But then there's, you know, the situation where you have transformation, where a new technology comes in and it totally eliminates a certain function. So the extent to which those functions are wrapped up in individuals, and that's the only function or set of functions that they have, there is going to be that kind of disruption. Lots of debate around, is this net positive, net negative in terms of the employment effects? We won't know until, you know, a decade or two down the road. Mm-hmm. I think what we do know is that for sure there is going to be new opportunity, and so there is inherent within that the need for the training for those opportunities. And you know, what I see in the work that we're doing is that universities and colleges, and I think especially at the college level, they're very tuned into this transition that's taking place and the disruption that's inherent in that, and so they're asking industry, how, you know, what do you need? How do we provide you with the skill set you need, so that you know, that there will be a transitioning of the nature of the workforce to a technology adapted manufacturing workplace. That's not a completely satisfactory answer to your question, because, you know, grosso modo, at a macro level, there are people who are going to be out of jobs. There's just no question. You know, again, I go back to the Oshawa closing. You know, as the union points out, GM's a profitable company. They're doing extremely well. So why are they doing this? You know, if it were business as usual, they would just keep on doing what they're doing. But they're not. You know, and they're recognizing as a corporation they need to change. And the reason they're changing is because of the implications of technology for what's going on in mobility. Mm-hmm. And so they're adapting to that change, and technology is underlying that adaptation. So there are profound disruptive effects in the job market as a result of that.
Absolutely.
So, and those people who, you know, who have dedicated their lives to kind of working in a plant in a certain way, now find themselves unemployed, wondering what they're going to do about that. At the same time, we also know that, you know, the unemployment levels are very low, and that most of the manufacturers, most of the business leaders are screaming for talent, and we need talent. So the disruptive effect of technology is clear and obvious, and yet net the employment situation is very positive.
Thank you. And as much as employees are going to face changes, managers, business leaders, what type of change are they going to see? What do they need to do this well?
Continuous learning applies to them as well, and the importance of being able to think outside the box, I think, is absolutely critical, because what technology now makes possible is whole new lines of business that you hadn't imagined before, and we're actually living through this at NGEN right now. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. The creation of these superclusters, the creation of the advanced manufacturing supercluster, it's a government program addressing a particular economic need. And it's not the first time governments have done anything like this, either the federal or provincial government. There's lots and lots of investments that have been made in trying to promote innovation. This is nothing new. If you look around, just looking around Southern Ontario, and look at the way in which federal and provincial governments have approached this, there has been a very strong undertone of the importance of face-to-face interaction. So if we're going to change our conservative business leaders, our cautious conservative business leaders, and get them we need to interact with them. We need to familiarize them. We need to acquaint them with kind of the new technologies, how to integrate them. So the underlying assumption is that needs boots on the ground. That needs bricks and mortar. That needs offices dotted across the geography. Mm-hmm. That's the standard model. If you're going to roll out a program and you're going to kind of try to promote this kind of change, you need people out there interacting with people. We accept that to an extent, but we also believe that that the 21st century is a world where all business leaders are very conversant with and are online all the time. And so data analytics has become very important. So we're investing a lot more money into the creation of a database that will serve as the underpinning for a collaboration platform where we envision any person in the advanced manufacturing space, whether you're on the technology side, on the manufacturing side, or the various corporate services that surround that space, a technology provider, financial services, HR, etc. But if your business is advanced manufacturing in one way or another, we want to facilitate through online, through a portal, access to the data that you're looking for. So if, let's say you're a small company in southwestern Ontario, and not in London, but some small town in southern Ontario, and you've got an idea for expanding that company with a new product line, but there's a type of material that that you've heard about and you want to find out about that. We want to be that place where that if you want to learn about that, that's where you can go. You don't have to leave your office of your tiny little shop. You can go online. Or if you're looking for new buyers for a product that you're developing, mm-hmm. and want to find out where those buyers are. Any of those services that you would, if you are as a CEO or a marketing officer looking at how do I grow my business, who else is there in my ecosystem, within my range, how do I find them? Mm-hmm. The old model would have you go kind of drive into London, go to that little office that the government of Ontario has put there, or the federal government, or whomever, find the person who's there, and depending on that person's expertise and ability to kind of communicate, that's how you would find out the answers to your question. You'd actually have to go. What we're saying is that's very old style. It is possible now to scrape data from a multitude of databases, gather it all together and say, this is for you if you're in the advanced manufacturing space. And, you know, buying, selling, looking for help, that's what we want to provide. Complementing that will always be the importance of human interaction. But the starting point, it's that demand. I mean, we live now in a society where the demand for instant gratification is paramount. And so if the gratification that a CEO is looking for is, where do I find X? The first thing you want to do is do this. Your knee-jerk reaction is to, I got to go online and find it. And what we want to do is build something that can be that kind of wraparound service. So in that way, we're digitizing the service delivery of awareness raising, buying, and selling.
And presumably it could have live aspects to it too. Someone could talk to someone.
Oh, sure.
Through the site and gain advice.
Yeah.
You could have live events where the people are presenting new knowledge or something.
Right.
Very interesting. That seems like a good idea. Okay. The next thing I want to ask about is you talked a little bit about innovation and how it's important. Do you have any advice that you would give to a manufacturing company that wanted to be more innovative today? What are some of the basic things that they might do in order to improve the innovation potential capability of their organization?
I think by definition, it involves getting out of your comfort zone. So think about what your comfort zone is, what's the routine that you're in, and how do you get outside that? So who are the people that are challenging you? Who are the companies that are challenging you? What is it out there? And then seek them out. Seek out expertise that can kind of inform your sense of what that might look like, and go after it. But innovation demands discomfort. It demands being prepared to accept not knowing, and frequently from a corporate perspective, this means looking outside. There are a lot of different approaches to kind of how one innovates within a company, but this notion of the immune system that exists within companies is very strong. You develop an immune system within a company. This is how we do stuff. We make it in this way. We've always done it this way. And to the extent that we change, we know how we change, and we change in this way. And so any agent of true innovative change in that environment is immediately attacked by that immune system within a company. So a CEO who says to herself, I want to effect change within my company, really needs to either make that very clear internally how that's going to be done internally and drive it forcefully from the top, or look outside and kind of understand kind of that external change agent, whatever that might be, and then think very carefully about how that gets integrated into the company.
Yeah.
Okay. Because it's that notion of the immune system within the company that's very, very strong, and it's just a natural effect. Any organization, I defy you to come up with an example of something that is inherently changing all the time. Companies don't do that. At the startup stage, you're told that you need to pivot all the time, but at a certain point, you've got a product or a service that you're selling, and then you're wanting to grow that, and you grow it within a system, and a system that's repeatable. Repetition demands kind of structure. Those changes anathema to that. So this notion of innovation is a very, very difficult thing to achieve within any organization.
Very useful idea, the idea of an immune system that has to be overcome in order to achieve innovation. Very, very helpful. Okay, we're also hearing, and you have alluded to this in what you've said too, about technology-based business models, that the business models that manufacturing companies will use in the future will be in some way different to the ones that they have today, that technology is enabling different ways of doing business, different products perhaps. Could you talk about that a little bit, how you think that type of change will manifest itself, I guess?
Well, in a sense, I think the change that I was describing earlier that NGEN is putting in place is an example of that. There is a model out there that is tried and true for how to affect change in innovation through these various instruments of government, and I see what we're doing as a really good example of how technology holds the possibility of changing that old model. In our case, we're all new at this in a sense, and we ourselves kind of recognize that we think this is the right way to go, but we realize that there's a lot we don't know. So we know we don't know a lot of the things we need to know. So it's how do we find that change, the agents of change that we need, and recruit them, integrate them, and then create the structure within which they will operate. So I think it's an example of what you're asking. And we also see the kind of immune system around us, because that immune system in this case is comprised of the existing models that governments have, federal and provincial governments. And what that has meant is, investments by those levels of government in infrastructure. Organizations that are publicly funded to do what we're saying we're not going to use you in that way. And so there will be resistance.
Absolutely.
And so that we're very mindful of the fact that as we go about attempting to develop this new model that is technology based, there will be resistance to that. That's probably not the answer we're looking for. Other technology-based businesses, when I think of the robotics world and what's happening in the robotics world, the limits are really almost boundless in terms of what can happen. Robotics is changing mining. It's changing forest. It's changing all our old industries. And it's actually an example of how our old industries, very commodity-based industries, for them to be competitive, have had to adopt these technologies. And some of them are world leaders in that. And you can see their competitiveness going up as they have taken a lead position in understanding the potential of technology. And when I was working in Ottawa many years ago, and the pulp and paper industry has been kind of a huge industry for Canada, and it's been hugely under stress, as the result of the U.S. kind of lobby, the effectiveness of the U.S. softwood lumber lobby. And if you look at the Canadian lumber industry across the country, it was very interesting at the time, and I'm out of date on this, but there were some companies that had clearly moved forward very aggressively in terms of integrating technology into their operations, and they were very, very competitive, and they could withstand the tariffs that were being imposed on them. But other companies that had been slow to change, were being hurt very badly by this. It's another area where you can see how technology is changing kind of the processes, just the old processes, and then in some ways introducing completely new lines of business for companies.
And as part of that, they are changing what they're doing. It's meaning they're working with different suppliers, different service providers, in what we're now calling new ecosystems. And this, I think, is a change for manufacturing companies. It's a change for some of the companies in those ecosystems. Could you talk a little bit about this aspect of the transformation they're going to be going through?
Yeah, I mean, and the ecosystem word is one that comes up an awful lot, and people wonder what that means and how we use that. You know, if you look at this question from the perspective of a tier one company in the auto sector, and you know, we have several here that operate globally, and so they have plants. It's not, they don't make everything here and then sell around the world. They have plants in, you know, 60, 70, 80 countries around the world. Mm-hmm. And so when you talk about supply chain in that respect, it means something very, very different from this notion that, okay, we've got a great big plant here, and you know, the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers are kind of all within 100 kilometers. It doesn't work like that. So a company that, you know, might be headquartered here is looking to solve a particular problem, understands a little bit about what it's looking for, but you know, this is a real R&D problem that they're looking to solve. And so they've got basically the world as their oyster. The world is their kind of research lab. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, they have the possibility of scouring the research community around the world to find the answers to their problem. And some of these companies are doing that. It makes sense because you want the best minds applied to your toughest problems. It also makes sense, that's just from the kind of the intellectual property standpoint. It also makes sense if you think of it from the perspective of them needing to do business in all of these different companies and needing to be seen as good corporate citizens in all of these countries. So if you think of it from the C-suite perspective, and you've got a technology problem that's going to affect all of the systems in all of your plants, and you want the best minds to apply to that question, you're a Canadian citizen, a Canadian headquartered company, but you're operating in Germany, and you want to make sure that your corporate responsibility reputation is in place. How do you make your decision? And that's what, you know, when we think about plugging into some of those great captains of industry here that have that kind of global footprint, and the quality of the Canadian supply chain feeding into that network, that's the challenge that we confront. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're not just competing, you know, these tier 2, tier 3 suppliers here who produce widgets for company X. They're not just competing with the other widget makers mm-hmm. in Southern Ontario. Mm-hmm. They're competing with widget makers around, you know, Germany, Japan, Korea, for that Canadian company's business. Mm-hmm. So this is the challenge for us in terms of how do we upgrade the quality of our ecosystem using kind of every step on that ladder of the ecosystem. How do we appeal to our Canadian champions that are, you know, loyal Canadian citizens, but needing to compete in a global market? How do we appeal to them to participate in an ecosystem upgrade so that our tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers can benefit from their global footprint?
Yeah, so that they can be the supplier of the plant in Germany
yeah.
and the plant
right.
in another part of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in a very clear sense, that's part of our challenge.
Yeah.
Because when we talk to those people, we talk to those leaders in those companies that have that kind of a global footprint, that's what they're putting in front of us. So yeah, I don't only sell in Canada. I have to sell around the world. And I want to grow my market share around the world. I'm happy to do everything I can for Canadian suppliers, but if they're producing for me, if the quality of the research going into it isn't a top tier quality, if the quality of the product that's being made isn't top tier quality, I'm going to suffer. My company's going to suffer. And so, it's how do we take the global competitiveness of those Canadian global champions and support the growth and the quality of the suppliers within that within the Canadian ecosystem.
So what you almost seem to be saying is that it's a potentially very exciting time in that the opportunities are there if we choose to take them. But at the same time, if we don't choose to take them, the impact could be quite bad for the Canadian economy, more than bad in many ways. So that exciting environment, my final question is about why today's students might want to go and work there. I mean, I can imagine that this potentially will be a very exciting time. There'll be lots of innovation, but I don't want to answer the question. Why should today's students look at manufacturing?
Well, I think it is a very exciting time. For one thing, I think today's young people, the world is their oyster. I mean, they are global citizens. Many of the students here come from away. They come from countries outside Canada. So they've already indicated, we're prepared to move. We want to move. We want to be out there. And so they themselves as individuals are already inclined towards a global perspective. I mean, and we're talking about the university, we're talking about post-secondary students here. And so by definition, they're people who see things in that way. And that's the way the economy is working. Now, there are counter forces to that, and we see them around the world. And the protectionism that we see raising its ugly head in different places is worrisome. But, the economics of this are clear. And so growth comes through trade. Growth comes through kind of expanding your marketplace, not shrinking it. And we also know that the ability to exploit that opportunity, to benefit from that opportunity, technology facilitates it. Technology also makes it really complicated, makes it very complex. And, I think today's young people love complexity. They're comfortable with complexity. They're comfortable with nuance. And so, I think it's a very, very interesting time. And, the making of things is kind of exciting in and of itself. And, when you can apply anything, you can just, what is it that you're looking to build? And, technology makes everything possible. So, I think the students who have an eye to an ever-expanding universe, this is a really, really good place to kind of get real about that.
Well, David, thank you for opening our eyes to the future of manufacturing. That's been the purpose of our discussion. I think what you've had to say will be very helpful in helping students understand what the future holds and the world that manufacturing is moving into. So thank you for taking the time today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.